Okay, so remember for next time, we're going back to volume D, right? We're going back to the purple one. So the texts that you're going to be reading for next time are British responses to the French Revolution. So you might be wondering, like, well, why the hell are we talking about the French Revolution in a British literature class? Well, because it actually has an enormous impact on British politics and also on Romanticism. So that is why we're going to be spending some time with this. You are also going to have timeline submissions due next time. So for next time, they don't have to be about the French Revolution, right? But try to keep them focused on like revolution and war in the period that we're talking about. So from about 1770 to 1835, right? Okay, does anybody have any questions about anything?
1770 to 1835?
Yeah. Yeah, let's make that the general window there. No questions? Okay, great. So what did you think of these poems?
Felt kind of edgy.
What's that?
Felt kind of edgy.
Okay, edgy how? What felt edgy about it?
I don't know. Like they seem like kind of like Auden and Muldoon's poems seem like kind of nice, sort of. They almost seem like nice homages to Yeats, but then at the same time they seem to like criticize him, kind of.
Okay.
They seem critical of the idea they seem critical of the sort of motivation behind Yeats's poetry.
Okay. So would most of you agree with that statement? That it sounds like Muldoon and Auden are both criticizing or undermining Yeats in some way? Okay. So where do you see the criticizing, the undermining, Alex, and like where, what part of Yeats's ideas do you think they're referencing?
So, in the memory of in the poem "In the Memory of W.B. Yeats,"
Okay, can you give us the page number?
816.
816. Thank you.
It says, "For poetry makes nothing happen. It survives in the valley of its saying where executives would never want to tamper. It flows south from ranches of isolation and the busy griefs, raw towns that we believe and die in. It survives a way of happening and
Okay.
So I think they're saying that they're saying that Yeats believes that poetry is meant to like spark change when it's meant to like sort of soothe the soul.
Okay, so you think that Auden is saying that Yeats has got kind of poetry's relationship to the world wrong?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, let's look at that whole short section there, right? Number 2, and In Memory of W.B. Yeats, because I think the part that comes before "For poetry makes nothing happen" is also really important to understanding what Auden is trying to argue here, right? You were silly like us. Your gift survived it all. The parish of rich women, physical decay, yourself. Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry. Now Ireland has her madness and her weather still, for poetry makes nothing happen. So if we look at that set of lines there, right? What does Auden seem to be arguing the relationship between poetry and the world is? Does poetry have an impact on the external world?
No. Poetry makes nothing happen.
Poetry makes nothing happen, right? But how does poetry itself come about, at least in this case? What is Auden suggesting turned Yeats into a poet? Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry, right? Yeah. The country you came from and its problems turned you into a poet. But your poetry did nothing to actually change the conditions of the country itself, right? So the relationship here seems to be that the external world affects the poet, right? Not the other way around. And I think that the fact that he says that Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry is also telling here, right? What else is this suggesting about where poetry comes from?
Pain.
Yeah.
And it also says, from wrenches of isolation and the busy griefs. So maybe feeling isolated, maybe alienated, kind of.
Yeah. Feelings of alienation. Good. I think that the raw towns part of this is important as well, in part because Auden also seems to be, in the earlier part of the poem, almost envisioning the poet's body as a country, right? If we go back further up to page 816, can I get somebody to read for us the stanza that starts with, "But for him it was his last afternoon."
But for him it was his last afternoon as himself, an afternoon of nurses and rumors. The provinces of his body revolted, the squares of his mind were empty, silence invaded the suburbs, the current of his feeling failed, he became him admirers.
Yes, this language of provinces and squares and suburbs, right? That the poet here is like a nation. And parts of them are kind of like divided up into the kinds of, into provinces and into cities, right? And I think we can make a connection between this and the idea of Mad Ireland hurting him into poetry, right? So like the poet kind of taking on the griefs of the country and trying to transform them through language, right? But it's the poet himself who's transformed, really, and not the world he's trying to affect. Right? These raw towns that we believe and die in. It survives a way of happening, a mouth. Now, let's maybe turn back to Yeats and to the specific lines that we think Auden might be referring to here. So if we go to Man in the Echo on page 240, what are the lines that Auden seems to be referencing when he says poetry makes nothing happen?
Nor can there be a work so great as that which cleans man's dirty slate.
Did that play send out certainly in the English eye?
Yeah, that's what he's specifically addressing here, right? Yeats's worries in this late poem, Man in the Echo is one of the last poems that Yeats writes before his death. And Yeats is, I think I mentioned this last time, Yeats lives a long time. He starts writing poetry in the 1880s, and he's still writing poetry up to the day he dies, right? And this is one of the last things he ever wrote. So this is an old man reflecting back on his life and his career and worried about the political implications of some of his art, right? And the effect that his art may have had on impressionable people, right? Did that play of mine send forth certain men the English shot? Did words of mine put too great a strain on that woman's reeling brain? Could my spoken words have checked that whereby a house lay wrecked? But what do you notice about the way he frames all of this? Is he saying, yes, I am responsible for all of this?
No, he's asking a question.
Yeah, it's all questioning, right? So he's not necessarily affirming, as Auden seems to maybe think he is, that this is what poetry does, right? And this is what my poetry did, and I have to be held responsible for it, right? You know, the lines before that, he says, now that I am old and ill, turns into a question till I lie awake night after night and never get the answers right, right? So he doesn't know for sure and doesn't feel he can know for sure whether it's his responsibility, right? Whether his poetry did this, whether poetry actually does make these kinds of things happen in the world. Now, let's try and connect this to the Muldoon poem, which contains one of my favorite lines in really just about any poem ever. Can I get somebody to just start reading, starting with, and we're Yeats living at this hour?
And were Yeats living at this hour, it should be in some ruined tower, not Malachited Bailey, where he paid out to those below. One gilt-edged scroll from his pencil, as though he were part Rapunzel, and partly Delphic oracle. As for his crass rhetorical posturing, did that play of mine send certain men, the English shot, the answer is certainly not. If Yeats had saved his pencil lead, would certain men have stayed in bed? For history so twisted root, with ardent small translucent fruit, and never the other way around, the roots by which we once were bound, are severed here in any case, and we are all now dispossessed. Prince, poet, construction worker, salesman, soda fountain jerker, all equally isolated. Each loads for sugar and salted beef cup into a covered wagon and strikes out for his Oregon. Each straining for the ghostly axe of a huge blonde-haired lumberjack.
Okay, so thank you. So this voice, as I think I mentioned at the end of last class, is not meant to be taken as the voice of Paul Muldoon, right? So Whiston here, the voice speaking of the poem, is W.H. Auden, right? So Whiston Hugh Auden, the same guy who wrote In Memory of W.B. Yeats, right? So it's ventriloquizing Auden here, right? And what seems to be the conclusion here? Like, I love the lines, if Yeats had saved his pencil lead, would certain men have stayed in bed, right? So how seriously does Muldoon's version of Auden take Yeats's self-torment?
Not very, but like, kind of seems to be like,
Sarcastic, please.
yeah.
Yeah, he's mocking it, right? It's just kind of the sing-song, silly little rhyme, right? Yeah, there's a tone of mockery here. And much of the reference here to Yeats's history, and were Yeats living at this hour, it should be in some ruined tower, not malachited valley. So malachited means, it's with reference to the color green. And malachited valley here refers to, on the one hand, a real tower. Yes, Yeats actually lived in a tower. He lived in a medieval Anglo-Norman tower in County Galway in Ireland. Not actually for very long, because as you might imagine, even in the 1920s, medieval towers are not really very convenient or comfortable to live in. But the tower becomes a really important symbol for Yeats of the poetic imagination, kind of rising up above the ground of everyday cares and looking out over the landscape of the everyday. And the idea of the poet as a kind of individual raised up above others. So if this sounds a little bit like Shelley and his unacknowledged legislators of the world, yeah, it is. Yeats is drawing on that explicitly. But the reason why Ballylee here is described as malachited is also because, like, the tower itself wasn't actually green. But Yeats published a collection of poetry, probably one of his best known collections of poetry, called The Tower. And the cover of that book features an impression of Ballylee, and the cover is green. So the reference here is actually to Yeats's book, not necessarily to his home. So were Yeats living at this hour, it should be in some ruined tower, not malachited Ballylee, like not his book about the tower. So he shouldn't be living between the pages of a book. He should be living in a real ruined tower. Down among the rocks and dirt and mess, right? And that these kinds of questions that he's asking are a kind of function of a kind of privilege, right? The privilege that the upper middle class poet has to kind of just rise above it all. So I want to look at the handout that I gave you for a minute, because I think that the segment of this poem that they give us in the anthology is actually a little bit misleading, because it is only an excerpt. And if we want to get at what Muldoon's actual position is, then we have to dig a little deeper and look a little bit at the rest of the poem, right? So 7 Middaw Street is an address in Brooklyn Heights. Auden lived there for a time and would host Thanksgiving dinners there. And so this poem is actually written in 7 different voices, all of whom are Auden's friends and fellow artists, and all of whom offer different takes on the idea of art and political commitment, right? So the voices in the poem are those of Auden himself, the dancer Gypsy Rose Lee. If any of you are familiar with the musical Gypsy, the music that this is the person the musical is based on. The composer Benjamin Britten. Auden's partner Chester Kallman. The painter Salvador Dali. The Melting Clocks guy. The novelist Carson McCullers. And finally, the Northern Irish poet Louis MacNeice. So, Louis has the last word. And the section that I gave you in the handout is from his part of the poem. So if we look, can we look just briefly here at the section that starts, "In dreams begin responsibilities." Can somebody read that for us?
In dreams began responsibilities. It was on account of just such an allegory that Lorca was riddled with bullets, and lay mouth down in the fickle shadow of his own blood as the drunken soldiers of the gypsy ballads started back for town. They heard him calling through the mist, "When I die, leave the balcony shutters open, for poetry can make things happen, not only can but must." And the very painting about Oyster is in itself a political gesture.
Okay, you can stop there, right? I think that's the part we want to focus on here, right? So what MacNeice is describing here is the death of another poet by firing squad during the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. Right, so I don't know, do any of you guys know anything about the Spanish Civil War? I will take your silence and the head shaking to mean no. Okay, all right. So, I can't recall the exact years, but the impetus for this was that Spain elected a socialist government at some time in either the late 20s or the early 1930s. And fascist forces under General Francisco Franco challenged the socialist government and eventually defeated them. Now this is particularly important for British poetry and British art, because a lot of British artists went over to Spain mostly to fight on the socialist side. A few fought on the fascist side as well. So Lorca is a Spanish poet who was on the socialist side, was himself a committed socialist, and who was killed by firing squad by Franco's men. So what does thinking about Lorca lead Louis' voice here to? What conclusion does he make from this? From Lorca's body riddled with bullets. Does Louis seem to think, as Whiston does, that poetry and life and politics are completely separate realms? Indeed not, right? And I think that in part what's going on here is that if poetry can't make things happen, then the death of people like Lorca is essentially for nothing, right? Poetry must be able to make things happen, or else the death of a poet is no particular tragedy, right? The murder of a poet is no particular tragedy. And because Muldoon gives Louis the last word, this still isn't Muldoon speaking directly at any point in the poem. But because he gives Louis the last word, I think this is probably something a little closer to the position that he wants to argue. And that is why I wanted to make sure that you saw this part of the poem as well. Because like I said, I think the anthology gives us a really incomplete picture of it, and can give us, I think, a misleading picture of Muldoon's work. But then there is one further thing that complicates this as well. So 7 Midoff Street is written in a format called Corona. Now, this is not Snoop Dogg's preferred brand of inexpensive Mexican beer. I mean, they're pretty good commercials, right?
Yeah.
Corona in poetry is a form it's a form written in sections. And the first line in each section echoes the last line of the preceding section. So, for example, in the full poem, the last line in the Gypsy section is just in case vaudeville does come back. And the first line of the Ben section that follows it is, come back, Peter, come back, Ben Britton. Right, so oftentimes in a Corona, like, it'll be the same line copied, but in more contemporary Coronas, it's usually just that there are echoes of that previous line in the next section, right? And then what tends to happen at the end of the poem is the whole thing circles back to the beginning. So the last line of the Louis section repeats the first line of the Whiston section. So the whole thing just kind of circles back to the beginning, right? Now, Corona is Latin for crown. And this particular type of poem is called this because it circles back around like a crown, right? So, Muldoon's whole thing is really kind of about being playful with language. And what he's doing here with this poem and circling back to the beginning is really kind of par for the course for him, right? He's not making any real commitment here, but just circling you back to where the argument started. So, you could argue that the Louis section is where his real aesthetic ideas are, but you could also argue that he's deliberately fudging the issue or muddying the waters by going right back to the beginning of the Whiston section at the end of the poem. So let's see if we can trace in Yeats's work. Let's look again at The Man in the Echo in an earlier poem of Yeats's, because Yeats's ideas do actually evolve over time here. So let's go to the fascination of what's difficult. Which is, among its other virtues, gloriously short. So page 219. We get a volunteer to read this for us.
The fascination of what's difficult has dried the sap out of my veins and rent spontaneous joy and natural content out of my heart. There's something ails our Colt that must, as if it had not holy blood, nor on Olympus leap from cloud to cloud, shiver under the lash, strain, sweat, and jolt, as though it dragged road metal. My curse on slaves that have to be set up in big delays. On the day's war with every knave and dolt, theater business management of men, I swear before the drawing comes around again, I'll find the stable and pull out the bolt.
Okay, thank you. So, I got some kind of pain in my foot, and it's it'll pass. Be okay. Yeah, I don't know if it's a bunion or what, but oh man, something is. All right. Okay. All right. I'm good. I just gotta be careful where I step and how I step. Okay. So, what's going on here with the Colt imagery? Can anybody figure that out, what the Colt is, or the footnote will help?
Well, is of course, but it also says something about Pegasus.
Yeah. So a colt is a baby horse, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, he is referring here to, right, the mythological Pegasus, right? And what was special about Pegasus?
They have wings.
Yeah, Pegasus could fly, right? So the Pegasus is a conventional image for poetic inspiration. But what's going on with Pegasus here? Okay, yeah, there's something ails our colts, right? So let's try to unpack that a little bit, right? So what does he seem to think ails Pegasus?
Being dragged on the ground.
Think about this more in terms not in terms of Pegasus himself being dragged on the ground.
Actually, him.
What's that?
But the author himself, or no?
Think about more the sorts of things we often expect horses to do.
They pull, like, carriages, whatever.
Yeah, they pull carts, they pull plows, things like that, right? So what's happening here, the thing that's ailing our colt, is that instead of being allowed to fly free, right, he's being forced to work like a normal horse. Yeah. There's something ails our colt that must, as if it had not holy blood, nor on Olympus leap from cloud to cloud, shiver under the lash, strain, sweat, and jolt, as though it dragged road metal, right? So his imagination is not leaping from cloud to cloud as it otherwise would, but it's being whipped and whipped into discipline, and forced to work at things that are mundane and unpleasant, right? My curse on plays that have to be set up in 50 ways, on the day's war with every knave and dolt, theater business, management of men. So what he's referring to specifically here is his day job as manager of the Abbey Theater. And what's the relationship here between the day job and his poetry? Yeah. At the end of the day, after all the bullshit he puts up with at work, right? He's too tired to write. Yeah. At the beginning of the poem, so the fascination of what's difficult has dried the sap out of my veins and rent spontaneous joy and natural content out of my heart, right? So yeah, the day job is getting in the way. So the relationship, so the poet, in order to be able to do his real work, right, Yeats seems to be arguing, needs to be unfettered from these kinds of day-to-day realities, right? The stable that Pegasus is kept in, right? I swear before the dawn comes round again, I'll find the stable and pull out the bolt. So he's looking to get his poetic mojo back, right? And finding it hard to do so with these other responsibilities. So responsibilities here of the ordinary kind, Yeats seems to regard as bad for the poet, right? Now, if we move to Man in the Echo, right, written almost 30 years later, can I get somebody to read that first section for us, spoken by the man?
Man, in a cleft left Christ and all, under broken stone and fault, at the bottom of a pit, that broad net of the moon has never lit, and shout secret to the stone, all that I have said and done, now that I am old and ill, turns into a question filled. I lie awake night after night, and never get the answers right. Did that play of mine send out certain men the English shot? Did words of mine put too great strain on that woman's reeling brain? Could my spoken words have checked that whereby a house lay wrecked, and all seems evil until I sleepless would lie down and die?
Lie down and die. So, first thing to note is this is taking place in a specific place. A lot of Yeats's poetry is keyed to specific places that are important to him. So, Alt, this cleft of rock he's talking about, is near a mountain called Knocknarea. Which is in County Sligo in the west of Ireland, near where Yeats grew up. So this is someplace where he spent a lot of his childhood. And he's returning as an old man, imaginatively, to this place that he remembers from his youth, right? And going back over events in his life and work. But what's the nature of an echo? What is an echo?
It's a repeating sound.
Okay, yeah, it's a repeating sound.
It's in a way it's bouncing back at you.
An echo is the sound when it's bouncing back against a solid surface where it cannot pass.
Yes.
At such a fast pace that it comes back and says the exact same.
Yeah. And whose voice produces the echo?
Your own voice.
Your own voice, yeah. So the man is not having a conversation with any kind of external being or force, right? He's having a conversation with himself. Right, and we see that the man does talk to the echo, right? And responds to the echoes, but all the echo does is repeat back the last thing that he said. Right. All seems evil until I, sleepless, would lie down and die. Lie down and die. But the echo itself, right, the conversation with himself, is a spur to thought, right? Does this sound familiar at all? Yeah, this is right out of Romanticism, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, this is by and large a poem about thinking. Meditating on a problem, right? So you have a natural catalyst, again, right, as you do in the greater romantic lyric. You have, the stone cleft that he is shouting at. But what the stone cleft does is help him have a conversation with himself about his life and work. So lie down and die, right? Can I get somebody to read That Were to Shirk?
That word is shirk, the spiritual intellect's great work, and shirk it in vain. There is no release in a buckin or disease, nor can there be a work so great as that which cleans man's dirty plate, while man can still his body keep. Wine or love drug him to sleep. Waking he thanks the Lord that he has body and its stupidity. But body gone, he sleeps no more until his intellect grows sure. That's all arranged in one clear view, pursues the thoughts that I pursue, then stands in judgment on his soul, and all work done dismisses all, out of intellect and sight, and sinks at last into the night.
Into the night. So the first part of this is an injunction against suicide, right? Is anybody familiar with those lines from Hamlet? His quietus make with a bare bodkin. Yeah, it's from the to be or not to be speech, where Hamlet is contemplating suicide, right? And Yeats is rejecting that path, which he thinks the echo is suggesting, right? Oh, just lie down and die. It's like, nope. Because that were to shirk the spiritual intellect's great work, right? So that's giving up on work that still remains to be done. And we have a kind of hierarchy here, right, of body, intellect, and soul. And how do each of these seem to work? How does he seem to regard each of these three faculties? What does he say about the body? what does the body seem to be to him?
Stupid.
Okay, he calls it stupid, right? The body and its stupidity, right? Okay, so let's think about it. Why is the body stupid?
Because wine or love drug keep them asleep.
Okay, yeah, so the body can be numbed, right, for one thing. The body is just pure physical being here for Yeats, right? Which is why it's stupid. It's just, your day-to-day automatic movement responses, right?
And then intellect is the mental, and then soul is the spiritual.
Yeah, exactly. So what Yeats is doing here is actually kind of building on a philosophical problem called mind-body dualism. Anybody familiar with this?
Sort of.
Okay. What do you know about it? Or what do you know about this particular problem?
Very little.
Okay.
I've barely done any reading on it. I've read about it,
Okay.
but I do know that the mind and the body there's a big problem between the mind and the body and how we can accept reality.
Yeah.
That there's a big problem there. I don't know about the other. I haven't think about
Okay. So yeah, mind-body dualism is primarily concerned with whether or not mind and body are separate substances or are part of the same whole, right? So, for example, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the French philosopher René Descartes. He's the "I think, therefore I am" guy.
Oh, that too.
Yeah.
it. Right.
So for Descartes, right, thought is what proves your existence, right? Which suggests to him that mind can exist separately of body. So mind and body for him are different things, right? They're separate beings. Because he can prove his mind exists, but he can't prove his body exists. You don't have to buy it. Okay? I see you looking very skeptical, yeah.
Matter cannot be created nor destroyed, so.
Yeah.
It,
Yeah,
it depends on how you look at that.
sure. And Descartes was a mathematician as well as a philosopher, so he's very much interested in like pure and abstract thought, right? And the creation of systems. So a lot of what he was trying to do was kind of reason back to first principles, like, okay, what can I actually prove if I throw away everything I think I know? And the only thing I can prove, or at least the first thing I can prove, is that if I think, right, I must exist. At the very least, my mind must exist. So what Yeats is actually doing is kind of adding a third element to mind-body dualism. He's adding this element of soul, which most of the mind-body dualists don't really talk about or cover, right? So body and intellect are both perishable, right? For Yeats.
But they can't prove a soul is perishable or even
Yeah, yeah. Although Yeats was a firm believer that souls were real. One thing, because we're gonna come back to Yeats at various points in the semester, in part because he's an enormously influential poet. But one thing that is slightly embarrassing for a lot of us who study Yeats is that he was also a wizard.
Okay.
Yeah.
What kind of wizard?
So he belonged to a society that was popular among the British upper middle classes in the 1890s and the early 20th century, called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn.
Okay, wait, so, did he believe in God? I'm just curious, because it seems that he talks about
Yeah.
it as if he did, and the way you say soul, and
Yeah.
that just
He-
confuses me.
He does,
Not
but
that
not,
wizards can't believe
Yeah,
in
yeah,
God,
no,
it's just
but yeah,
curious to me
so
that
he-
would
he-
be a wizard.
he does, but he doesn't really believe in the conventional Judeo-Christian God, if that makes
Okay.
sense.
That makes a little bit more sense.
Oh,
Yeah.
It just throws me off a lot.
Yeah, so Yeats's whole philosophy is a kind of rejection of conventional religion and conventional rationalist thought. He's very much he hates Descartes, right?
So he's like agnostic.
No, because he does believe in things. So an agnostic believes that you can neither prove nor disprove the existence of God, right? Basically a fence sitter, but won't take a stance.
He's a
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty much.
Well, yeah. Anyway, the point I was trying to make with the Golden Dawn is that these were they wore robes and silly costumes and waved stabs around.
Hey, don't call them silly.
Well.
We believed it.
Yeah, well, Auden called him silly, but also
If
but also included himself in that, right? So
If
yeah.
there is a will, there is a way.
Dream is a wish for a heart makes.
Anywho, I know it's late. I know we're getting on to the end of the day, and our brains are tired, right?
I don't know that wizard stuff.
Yeah. Well, we'll probably talk about a little bit more of that later, but okay. I may as well just kind of lay this out
Please,
now in the last
I want.
5 minutes. What? Yeah. We're not really going to go into wands.
Well, I don't care about the wand. I just want to know if you cared.
Yes, you did.
Sweet. That's all I
Did
cared
you go to
about.
Hogwarts?
That's all I cared about.
There is no such place as Hogwarts.
Are we sure about that? We're just muggles, we don't know that.
I know, but the Golden Dawn and organizations like it had their own little like Masonic lodges and libraries and things like that, where they would study the tarot and study ritual magic and things of that nature. So yeah, they were trying to call beings from other worlds into existence and things like that. There was a kind of like, in the late Victorian period, there is a kind of wholesale rejection of conventional religion and spirituality. And Yeats is a participant in movements like that. But Yeats laid out his philosophy in a book called The Vision. And one thing I want to make clear before I go too deeply into this is that no one else ever believed this, right? This system is entirely Yeats's own invention, and it's questionable whether he actually believed in it or not, or was just using it to create metaphors for poetry, right? So the first part of this is that everyone has a self and an anti-self or mask, right? Your true essence and what you appear to be to others.
That's true.
And these are determined in some way by moon phases, although it's never really quite clear how that works.
The time thing,
Do we need to write this down?
You probably should, yeah, because it will come up later.
Okay.
The other thing that is important about this theory is that what you should strive for is a union of self and anti-self, right? You should strive to bring your mask and your true self together
I'm getting Persona vibes.
into what he calls unity of being. Yeah, although he's actually, I think, coming to these conclusions. I'm not entirely sure, but I think he might be coming to some of these conclusions earlier than Jung does. And also with less science behind it.
He's a wizard. Don't make fun of him.
The other important thing about this is that it's all connected to a theory of history, right? And this is where things get real batshit nuts.
We're not there yet.
We're not there yet. So history for Yeats is moved along by a pair of interlocking cones that he calls gyres.
Okay.
And one of these gyres
Those guys.
is,
Am I supposed to draw this?
yes.
All right. Here we
Where you going with this, Yeats?
One is connected to objective reality. It is to kind of like external things and order and social values and things like that. And the other he calls subjective. And when the subjective cone is dominant, when the subjective gyre is dominant, then individualism and personal heroism tend to reign, right? So the back and forth between these moving cones, right, essentially shapes history for Yeats. And he believed that in the 20s or so, we were coming to the end of an objective era and the beginning of a new subjective era. So he really did believe that we were kind of at the cusp of some sort of enormous historical revelation, right? That the Judeo-Christian era was coming to an end and was going to be replaced by something different and for him more interesting. So this is something to keep in mind when we come back to Yeats, right? Because it will come up again. I know it's wacky, right? It's out there. He came up with this system through automatic writing experiments with his wife, right? So they would sit together in their living room.
And he didn't do drugs, right?
Well, I mean, in his youth, he did experiment with hashish and with opium,
We all do.
as a lot of people did.
We
Yeah,
all do.
yeah,
In
sure,
your youth, we all do.
of
okay?
course, yes.
He's just.
Yeah, but by this time he's in his 50s, and this is all him, right?
He could still be doing it in his 50s.
But I was just saying, he and his wife were sitting there. I mean, it's not, you wouldn't think.
Yeah,
Thinking about.
Well, so what the way this would work, right? And we'll kind of finish with this because we're at about time here. So they would sit together, and they would do something, some sort of thing to invoke the spirit, right? And she would close her eyes and write things in a book that were supposedly told to her by the spirit guide.
I think I know what she was using.
Now, yeah, so there are they actually all these manuscripts are preserved in the National Library of Ireland, and you can see things in the notebooks like the medium needs a glass of water, and where the spirit tells Yeats what the medium needs.
Yeah, shit, cotton mouth,
Yeah. Sure.
I really wasn't
Sure.
trying to be funny. I was dead serious.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I am too. So was Yeats. I mean,
Yeah,
I mean, he was deadly serious about this and absolutely believed in it.
Right.
So, and I think that's the thing is this seems comical
Yeah.
to us, right? But one thing we have to remember is that it wasn't to him.
There's
And this is
a
the
lot of TikTokers that, I mean, legit, I've seen a lot of TikTokers that believe in a lot of stuff like this, and
Yeah.
I only
Mhm.
watch their stuff because they talk about musicians and stuff like that, and then I'll go down and they're
Sure.
like, that they're a mom and sister of witches, and I'm like,
Yeah,
They believe in this?
Oh, okay.
They believe
let
in this?
me find
Yeah.
Motley Crue again.
Uh-huh.
But I was trying to watch.
But yeah, no,
Sometimes, yeah, I didn't mean to.
Yeah, no, but I mean, this was not we kind of got off track here a little bit, but I don't think we got off track in a way that isn't going to be useful for us later on.
This is very useful. I just needed to know. He's a wizard, first of all.
Yes.
Second of all, he has a very cool. He's nice. He likes to leave in masks, and covering up his true self and
Yeah.
phases and whatever that is. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and
Yeah.
But the reason why this is important to know is because it makes when you know the way he viewed the world, right? It makes a lot of the poetry that's otherwise a little impenetrable make a lot more sense.
Yeah. This dude's just crazy.
Well, he has a particular set of beliefs that animate, beliefs about history in particular, and about the particular historical moment he's in, that animate a lot of his poetry.
What if he cast Stupefy on himself?
Doesn't work quite that way. These guys were ritual magicians. Everything they did took a long time, and you had no evidence that it worked.